Hello, everyone, and welcome to Outraised Voices. I'm your host, Sharon Lee Williams, and I want to say I hope you're having a joy-filled day. If you've watched Outraised Voices before, welcome back, and thank you for your continued support. If you're new here, welcome, and thank you for joining us. So today, we have a special guest, Elysha Andrews. She will be our CEO today. I know every guest is a special guest, but Elysha is special. So while Elysha might not have been raised in foster care and she's not an adoptee, her story, I felt, resonates with the themes that we explore here on Outraised Voices. Her family dynamic is one that many of our viewers might relate to. Elysha was raised primarily by her father, and today she's going to share her journey, reflecting on her relationship with her mom, the emotional challenges she faced, and the transformative path she's walked to become the person and the mom she is today. So let's dive in and hear from Elysha herself about her path to healing and empowerment. But before we do that, I am going to read Elysha's bio. All right. Elysha Nicole Andrews, mentor and author of the newly released book, Get Real. I am triggered. I love this title. How to Parent with a Narcissist and Disarming Triggers. The book navigates the complexities of family life with insight and resilience. A devoted mom to her son Jeremiah, Elysha has triumphantly recovered from alcohol addiction and is embarking on a transformative journey. That's Elysha. Welcome, Elysha. And thank you. Thank you for showing up and sharing your story and being part of this community and journey. Thank you. I appreciate it. And our viewers appreciate you. Here's how we'll start. We'll start from how did you end up living with your dad, or how did that all come about, and where was your mother in the picture and how old? You tell us your story from the beginning.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me onto your platform. I truly do appreciate and honor what your platform represents.
Thank you.
To answer your question, if I was to recall back, I've always lived with my dad. It started, I know that my parents separated when I was about 3, and there was a lot of back and forth on where my brother and I should be. And ultimately, my grandmother on my dad's side, who my dad was living with, was like, I'm home and let me take care of the kids. So in the home was my dad, my grandma, my grandpa, and sometimes my uncles were in and out. But for the most part, my dad was working. And when he wasn't working, he was outside having fun. So I was always home with my grandma. It was very challenging having a relationship with my mom. You could tell that the dynamic between my parents was fizzling out into parenthood. And it was
Can I just stop you for a second here? So just because when you say your dad raised you, but you're almost like, just for our viewers, it's almost like kinship care. So your grandmother, you end up with your grandmother predominantly because your dad is doing other things or growing his way, or so you and your brother are there in kinship care. So they're separated, but do you see your mom? How often do you get to see your mom?
Initially, I believe it was every other weekend. It wasn't consistent.
By her choice, or?
I think it was both.
Oh, okay.
At times, my dad was being complicated and making it hard for her to have a relationship with us.
Right.
I remember times where she would try to come and pick us up, and there would be a fight at the door. And then it would be, your mom doesn't love you. Look how she never came to pick you guys up.
Yeah.
And so there was those challenges in trying to figure out where I belonged and how come everybody else had their mom and dad together. And then here we were and barely knew who our mom was.
Right, right. So you remember those, when do you really start to feel those feelings that?
I want to say that it really started to hit home when I was between 6 and 8 in that transition period. By the time I was 8, we had moved into a house. So we were in an apartment together up to this. And it was me, my dad, and my brother in one room. And my grandparents had another room. So they bought a house and I got my own room. And I remember being 8 years old, staring out the window like, I just wish on this star that I would have my mom. I want to have my mom. I want my parents to get back together. I want to know what normal feels like. And a year after that, she had my sister, and my dad would use that as kind of like a, look how she's always with the baby and she's not with you guys. By the time my sister turned 1, I was in the hospital for a week with an asthma attack, and it was the week of my sister's first birthday, and my mom couldn't come. And my dad used that to be like, the baby's more important. She doesn't love you guys. You weren't even invited to the birthday party. And being 10, 11 years old, you're not thinking, oh, it's because the baby, why you can't, you know what I mean? Like, you
don't have the language. You don't have
I know is that my mom's not there.
Yeah, exactly. So, what you know is, my mom's not here. She made this choice to do that. We don't know all the surrounding, whatever is happening in your mom's life and what's happening there. You're just thinking about you. You're just this young girl and feeling, it's like the sense of abandonment in some ways.
It definitely was. I absolutely suffered with this, the sense of abandonment and neglect. I often felt that in every relationship, and I didn't identify that until the last few years, that's what I was pursuing.
Wow. So now, did your brother feel the same way, or did you have that conversation, or? It's
funny because we grew up in the same house until I moved in with my mom when I was 12, but we have very different experiences and we remember things very differently. Yeah. So when we did end up having that conversation, there was a lot of things that he was experiencing that I had no clue about because I was focused on me.
Of course.
I am like this. Why is this happening to me? How come nobody loves me? And I didn't even stop to consider that we were going through this together.
So have you had a chance to talk to him, or we don't have to have the conversation necessarily, but did you talk to him about those feelings and his feelings? So you're now 12 years old. Does he stay with your dad?
Yeah, so he stayed with my dad for a year. I want to say it was the year after that he came and lived with us for a year. And in that year, he was like, oh, no, I'm going back to dad's house. This is too much.
Oh, wow.
It was a lot going on. So he moved back in with my dad, and he stayed there until we were adults, in late teens, early adulthood. I think he did like a year or 2 of high school with my mom. But at that point, I'm 3 years older than him. So I was already living my best life. So we didn't have that.
I was living my best life. But so let's take it back. You're 12 years old. So how does this happen that you end up living with your mom and your dreams come true and wish upon a star, and here you are?
It was a lot of moving pieces. I was being extremely rebellious. I was going through what I didn't realize or identified as struggling with the impacts of sexual trauma. And so I was projecting it in every way possible. And so at this point, I had the internet at my fingertips. So I was sneaking off, and I was 12, sneaking off to sign on to Black Planet, sneaking off to sign on to, like, B2K was my favorite group at that point. And they had little forums with fan fiction. So I was able to sneak into those little rooms and have adult conversations with adults.
Ooh, that's a big topic right now. Big topic.
And I was addicted to it. So I used to get in trouble for constantly being on the internet and having conversations with older men, but that's what I was familiar with, right? And nobody knew I was struggling. I didn't express it. There was no big conversation about it.
And
And
did you know you were struggling? Because you're just going through, you're doing this, you're doing the doing and being the being, but did you actually say, oh, I'm struggling to myself?
No, it's funny enough. Last year, when I identified it at 31 years old, I said I spent my whole life saying to women, like, I don't know what that feels like and not being able to relate to their childhood trauma. And then I was like, that's because I normalized it. I didn't realize it was abuse. I didn't realize that it wasn't okay. And that's what I brought into my relationships with me and what I expected out of people. So it wasn't until I was 31 that I was like, oh my goodness, I've been abused my entire life. And that's what framed my idea of what relationships and sex should look like. So while I was navigating this at 12 years old by myself, it caused a lot of friction between my dad and I. And my dad didn't know how to have female conversations with me. He didn't know I had gotten my period. He didn't, like, I was hiding it. I thought I was hiding it. I think my mom knew. My grandpa used to give me allowance. So whenever I'd get my period, I'd use my allowance to go buy pads. And so at this point, we were going through this and he didn't know what was wrong with me. And then one day I was sitting on the computer and he started screaming at me, and I had used my mom as an excuse to stay on the internet. I'm just waiting for my mom to get on MSN so I can message her. And he screamed at me. He got up and he went to grab me, but I jumped up at the same time and he hit me in the corner of my face. So I have this big bruise in my face. And when my mom found out about it, she used that as the opportunity to bring me into her care. So police
okay. I don't want to trigger you with the sexual thing, but just to know that happened in your in before the age of 12.
Yeah, I was about 6.
Okay. So, oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry you went through that. I really am sorry you went through that. So here you are, and you're going through, you're on, I just want to, sorry, I'm a little old, BTS, BTQ,
B2K, B2K, my music group.
So sorry, y'all out there. But that's music as a healer, right? Because we always talk about that because we have places to go with music. And when you say you were rebellious, that was the extent of your rebellion, like going to these rooms, these secret rooms, and.
When I was 12, I want to say that was the beginning of it. I was very argumentative and I would fight. It was a power struggle. So at this point, my grandma would say things to me and I'm like, shut up. And I'm screaming and, I was very vocal. But it was behavioral up and until this point. More behavioral symptoms, very challenging. Simple things, simple stuff like go and brush your teeth and I'd turn it into an argument, right?
Right. Because you had to express it it had to come out some way.
It had to come
the
out
anger
some way.
And the hurt and the abandonment had to come out some way. So it came out in this form.
Right. So with the secret group chats, it was the beginning of what started to snowball into addictions and more trauma.
When addictions, it was just the alcohol or?
No. So when I moved in with my mom, there was a relative that lived in the neighborhood who, when I started to experience my cramps, was like, well, just take a Percocet, just have an Oxycontin, take a Tylenol 3. So it started with narcotics, actually, over the counter, not even over prescription narcotics, sorry. And she would mix me martinis. Have an apple martini. Here's a beer. So I started drinking at about 12, 13 years old. And it was normal because that's what everybody around me was doing.
That's normal.
By the time I was 15, I had tried my first cigarette. So every so often I'd sneak off and have a cigarette. So by the time I was 16, I was 6'3". I understood how to dress to go into the LCBO without getting carded. So I would put on my mom's clothes, do my hair like my mom. I knew how to do her signature, so I'd sign myself out of school.
So did your mom know any of this was going on, or she wasn't able to stop you, or she was, I mean, I can't ask you to speak for her mentality or what she was thinking at the time, but did you think that your mom knew what was going on?
There were times where she had no clue. And then there were times where she would get concerned. So she would come home from work and bring me in the bathroom, make me pee on a pregnancy test. Or she would open up my mail and go through my bank statements just to figure out what's going on, because she knew there was something off, but she couldn't pinpoint it. And there were times where she did know, but she just didn't know how to stop it.
Right.
So she would try to involve maybe other family members or community, and that made it worse. Why
does that make it worse?
It was who she called. Some of the people that got involved didn't even know how to communicate with a teenager, much less one like me. Some of them blamed me for the way that I was behaving.
Of course, yeah.
There was a time where, as far as was concerned, I had just lost my virginity because I couldn't remember what happened to me as a child. I was 15 when it happened, and we got caught, but it was not consensual. I did not walk into this knowing that that's what I was going to do. So when I gave voice to what happened and expressed it, they said, that sounds like rape. And I was like, I guess it's rape. So me now as an adult, it was rape. But when I had expressed it, all of the adults that were involved blamed me for it, because he said it was consensual and they went with what he said. So it changed the way I trusted adults the first time that I spoke up about it. So every time those adults got involved, I didn't want anything to do with them.
Yeah, that happens. You hear that, and I've heard that when I was young. Or the way you're dressed had something to do. You had no business up in there. Why were you You were flirting, and boys are boys. We hear all that when we're young, and how the fault is. The blame is put on us, as if we are trying to have this. It's a destination. It's not a destination. So, so now you're 15 and you're going. All right. So I'm just getting the timeline. So from 12 on, you're with your mom, and you're now going through all these. You're going through addictions. You're going through whatever you're going through, young teenage rebellion, and when do you decide that you're either had enough, or when do you decide you're going to try and mend the relationship with your mother? When does that become important to you to do that?
Funny enough, I spent a lot of time seeking her approval. So I became a people pleaser. I would do things just to be like, see, I'm here. I did it. You love me. Like, let's do this. We're in this together. And so there were times where it would start out like, okay, we're mending this relationship. We're figuring each other out. And then here comes somebody else, another relationship in her ear to be like, your daughter's a problem. She's a menace to society. She's bad. She's all of these evil things. And their voices would take control of our relationship. It would change the dynamic again. So there were a lot of times where I got kicked out consistently, and I would still come back home and I would stay with friends. I'd get into more trouble outside, get assaulted again, become even more addicted. I had fake ID. I was getting into the club from the moment I was like 17. When I got into my 20s, by the time I was 24, I stopped going back home. It was no longer an option for me. So I couch surfed. I bounced around.
Are you working at this time? Did you have a job?
I was almost always working. From the time I was 16, I had 2 or 3 jobs at a time. So school wasn't even a priority to me sometimes. I dropped out for a year, went back and finished. There was a time where we were living in Aurora, I was going to school in Richmond Hill,
Hmm.
and I was working two jobs downtown Toronto, and I was commuting on transit.
So you're a pretty responsible, well, woman now, but you were a pretty responsible young youth
Yeah.
at that time. That, I'm doing these jobs, even though I have these other issues going on, I have to take care of myself in this way. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to go and travel and live far Aurora. I'm not sure where it is, but it's somewhere. It's a
Yeah.
distance to get to Richmond Hill. For those of you listening, this is happening in Toronto at the moment, but
Yeah.
so it is a distance, and it shows just your resilience and your mindset and your fortitude and how strong you are. Who knows where that came from? Is that a DNA thing? I wonder. We don't know. I don't know how that works.
Right. I think it was, I think it's because I spent so much time with myself.
With yourself, you said?
With myself and having to rely on myself. Very early in living with my mom, I learned that I had to figure it out on my own.
Mm-hmm.
And after she had my brother, I was, I think, 14 when she had him. There were a lot of times where she was struggling to make ends meet. So if I wanted to sustain this life I was living, I had to find the money at some way, one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it was legally and sometimes it was illegally, but I made a way to figure it out.
Right.
And when I could help at home, I would give money to mom, or there were times where I'd bring my brother to school with me. And he would come to class with me, and some teachers understood and would help me out. And some teachers were like, what is this? Why are we doing this? So even now there's people who see me and they're like, so you had a kid in high school, right? And I'm like, no, that was my baby brother. I was helping out at home. If my mom had a job interview, she didn't had a job and she couldn't get to work without babysitter, I would step in and fill in the gap. So for me, I thought I was always in the position where I was trying to mend, and then people would come in and then there would become this big rift again. And by the time I was 24, I was like, I'm not doing this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not chasing after mommy.
Mm-hmm.
I started to identify that I had mommy issues because I would start to adopt moms. I'd go to people's families and they'd love me and I'd love them, and I'd start calling them mom. And now we have this great relationship, and, everything they said I would do, you need help with this, and I'm running behind them. So I had adopted a mom at this point, and I became a part of this family who gave me a roof over my head.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got pregnant, that's who I went home to and said, hey, mom and dad, I'm pregnant.
That's interesting. Just the language you just used. That's who I went home to. So home became this other group of people who weren't related to you, I take it.
No.
They were not related. So where is your father now? So, not now, but during this time that you're transitioning.
In my early teens, when I moved in with my mom, I took on her argument and started arguing back with my dad. And I would call him every nasty name in the book that I was taught to speak to him with. So he distanced himself a bit, rightfully so. I did hurt my dad. I hurt him so much while I was a teenager. So he distanced himself. And then when I was 19, 20, this was the summer that when I returned my bottles to the beer store, I got $20 back. And so they're looking at all of these bottles lined up in my room, and they're like, you're an alcoholic. And I was like, no, I'm not. I am not. And my dad's looking at me. I've got all these tattoos now. I had 18 piercings. I was chasing pain. So as much as it hurt, I was there for it.
Wow.
And I enjoyed it. Like I used to go to fetes or soca parties and get bruised and wake up the next morning and I'd be counting my bruises like, oh, look at my stripes, my trophies. I had a good time last night. So at this point, my dad had distanced himself a bit. So when I did get pregnant, I didn't tell him until I was about 3 months pregnant. I was 25. I said, Dad, I'm pregnant. And the father doesn't want anything to do with the situation. But being who my dad is, he jumped right in. He's like, I'm going to be your grandfather. And he took time off work whenever I had doctor's appointments. When I was hospitalized for 6 weeks before I had him. and before I had my son, and my dad was in the hospital with me. Sometimes he'd come in after work, he'd spend hours with me, and he was just right there as if nothing happened.
So this reconnect happens when you think your dad is like, whatever, the name calling goes on, he's not going to be there. The love shows up when it was really, I mean, it was always needed, but this is like a big part of your life here, being pregnant. Lord knows I know that one, but that's a big part of your life. Now, while this is happening, he shows up in the hospital, and now where's mom with the pregnancy?
So when I got pregnant, mom and I weren't even speaking. And then I showed up and I went to her house. I went to her house and I said, so I'm pregnant. I'm 4 weeks pregnant. And she was like, okay, all right, let's try to figure this out. And she knew the living situation I was in. So she was like, okay, come home. I tried to come home for a few weeks, and her husband was there, and it just we did not. We were fire, water. It did not work at all.
Yeah.
So I ended up leaving again and staying with my dad. After I got out of the hospital, I lived with my dad for a year, which was a blessing and very eye-opening that he would even open his door. Because at this point, he's married. He has his stepkids. They're in a house together. And he lets me in with my son, and I stayed with them rent-free for a year. It was such a blessing. But at this point, my mom and I are now trying to figure out what this looks like. So we'd communicate.
So this is while you're with your dad. Your mom is saying, okay, let's try and work this out, because I really want to be there for you, and you really want her in your life. I mean, you really want this same wish upon a star thing. You know, you still want that. So how did you work it out?
Funny enough, again, last year, I'm 31 years old, and I'm going through this healing journey. And as I'm getting sober, my childhood's coming back to me. Memories are coming back to me, things that have happened to me. So I had started communicating with my family, like, this happened. Do you remember this? Did you see this? Were you aware of this? So I started having conversations with them. And at the same time, the family member or the relative that exposed me to the narcotics and the alcohol kind of exposed her hand a little bit with both mom and I. So she was on the phone saying one thing to me, and then she'd get on the phone and say another thing to mom. So we were having issues with each other and didn't even realize it. I was like, why is mom acting like this? Why is she treating me? We were fine yesterday. Where is this coming from? So when the situation blew up, and we found out that it was years of manipulation and lying and deceit, we looked at each other and we were like, oh no, we need to come to each other. So we were able to, at this point, and you know what? It had to happen at the time that it did, because if this happened years ago, we wouldn't have been in the place to hear each other. But we sat down and we were able to say, okay, this and this and this happened. This bothered me. This is where I felt like I needed an apology. And we were able to have an open conversation. So since March of 2023, we've been rebuilding and getting to know each other for who we are today, instead of holding yesterday against each other.
Yeah, holding the old story, because it's all growth. It's not, I always look at it because your mom was a child somewhere, and whatever was put in her head, and how that, whatever she brought to her relationships and her children, and the growth that happens, it doesn't stop. It doesn't stop. And especially when you love somebody and you want to be there for them and you want to be better, and being a mom is a huge thing. So, so it takes all this time to get there. Now, as a mom, did you notice, I don't know, how old is your son?
He's turning 8 this year.
So have you noticed your parenting style has changed? Now, you're a single mom, I understand.
Yeah.
So has your parenting style, how is your parenting style?
Luckily for my child, I took a child and youth work program a year after he was born. So it gave me a different type of foundation to parent from, to identify who he is. So I knew from he was 18 months that he has autism. It hasn't been diagnosed yet. We finally got an assessment request for that.
So he has
But
autism.
I would just being able to label the behavior made me different from my parents because my parents ran from my ADHD assessment. And I feel like had they gotten my ADHD assessment and diagnosis, it would have been able to hit a root cause to the help that I needed and given me access to resources and therapy that I needed at that time. Even just behavioral, like if we're going to remove the trauma off the table, there was still the behavioral piece that needed to be addressed.
Right.
So, putting a name to my son's behavior and identifying who he is and parenting him based off who he is. And when I identified my trauma, I was able to realize that traumatized parents raise traumatized children. I was parenting from my trauma and exposing him to the things that I experienced. And when I realized that, it changed how I communicate with everybody and what he witnesses. For example, his father's not around, and I am co-parenting with a narcissist. So there was a lot of arguments that I didn't realize were set up, but he anticipated my reaction to it because I became what was making me sick. So
wait a minute, your co-parent, the dad. So that's good because I wanted to get to that in the book. Your son's dad is the narcissist. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're coping. Well, I just want to say this. I want to say congratulations, but I don't mean that. I mean it bigger than that. Bigger than that. What you've done. Overcoming a lot of these traumas, and I look at your tattoos, which happen to look beautiful, and I'm saying those are your scars in a way.
Yeah.
Those tattoos of resilience, those tattoos, your journey, those are your scars.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say that because honestly, I hope you look in the mirror and applaud yourself and say, I'm doing my thing. I'm living my best life. And just, you're teaching your mom. You've taught your mom because, and I'm not speaking for them, but all the diagnosis, my son is 36, and all these diagnoses that came in, ADHD, and now that is especially for a Black family, taking these labels, and I hear this a lot with parents, just the labels, like what is that? Because we didn't have that as kids. We didn't understand. So you don't know what you don't know, and you run away from things that go, come on now.
Right.
Come on now, ADHD, you all want to label that child. No. So the fact that you have this awareness for your son.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. What other, are you taking training now in something? Because we'll talk about the book, but there's so much I wanted to dig in with you. But your son with autism, how does your heart hold that?
It's been quite the journey. I recently had to go through the motions of processing it because a doctor finally acknowledged what I've been saying for the last 7 years, right? And when I had first started to say it, they were like, he's, maybe he's just delayed because he's a boy. He was born premature. He was born at 33 weeks. And he was in the NICU for 2 weeks before we came home. And I didn't leave his side. I slept on the cot beside his incubator. I was like, I'm not coming out of this hospital. But when we came out, we were in and out the hospital, different specialists, different doctors, speech therapy, because he didn't speak in full sentences till he was 4.5. And even then I still had to translate for him because he knew he did not speak as eloquently as the other kids around him. So he was insecure about his speech. So sometimes he would communicate with me to talk on his behalf. And looking back at it now, I think that it's amazing that he was even able to do that and rely on me in that way.
Well, look at the mom he has.
Yeah.
Look at his home, you are home. And your all of this, your journey, your resilience, your what you overcame, what you're working towards. And I do want to bring in, I understand you have a faith-based, you are also very faith-based. I think we talked a little bit about that. So that your son has a complete mama who, understands so much. And when he becomes a teenager, and I mean, he's going through challenges now, but teenager, it doesn't matter where you start from. That time in our lives seems to be the craziest of times. I don't know what it is, the hormonal, what it is, So he is very lucky to have you, and he's very lucky to have his grandfather, and very lucky to have his grandmother, because you're all working together.
Yes.
It's not like this separated thing now. You're working together. This is the umbrella. This is home, and don't anybody mess with it. Don't mess with it. So, well, let's move over to the book.
Okay.
Let's talk about that. So how does that come about? And give me that title again.
Get Real, I Am Triggered.
It's a great title. Great title.
Funny enough, the book came about because of my child's father. So I was actually going to compare to how unhealed trauma shows up in your kids. So when I was a child, my mom and my dad got into this big fight. And by the time the fight was done, I was in the car with her with my brother. And when we drove off, police came zooming into the building parking lot and had my dad held up at gunpoint. And the last thing I saw before we drove off for the whole weekend was my dad held up at gunpoint. And I had to spend the entire weekend wondering if my dad was okay. Is he in jail? Did he get shot? Came home the Sunday. My dad was fine, but he never spoke about it. And there's a lot my dad doesn't speak about, so I hope he doesn't mind me telling this story, but he doesn't talk about any of it. So when I became an adult and I realized all that we went through as kids, on top of me taking things out on him, regardless of how I feel he handled the situation, he went through a lot and was a buffer for a lot of the things that we experienced as kids. And while I was processing that, the courts had given my child's father access again to see my son. And in one of the weekends that he was supposed to pick my son up, 2 weeks prior to this, I had said to him, you show up here at my building with your girlfriend. I've never met her. I had no clue at this point it was his fiance. I had no clue what was going on. And so I said, I'd like to know her in the sense where I want us all to be on the same page when it comes to my son's care. He has a lot of things going on, and I would like to know what's happening when he's not with me, just so that I have a base, because I'm the only one going to these doctor's appointments and communicating and advocating for him. And he's like, yeah, no problem. You guys should know each other. So this specific Friday that he showed up, I walked up to the car and knocked on the window, and she's not turning her head to look at me. And I was like, okay. So when she unlocks the door, I open it to say, hi, I'm Elysha, Jeremiah's mom. And he starts to lose it in the back seat. He yanks my son out the car, drags him out. He loses his shoe. He throws him on the sidewalk, and he starts to call the cops on me. And while he's calling the cops on me, I immediately went back to being in the car with my mom when the cops showed up for my dad. So I stopped talking. My son is bawling in my arms. I just want to go with daddy. Why is he's not used to the arguing, because I don't argue in front of my son. And so when the cops showed up now, I'm sitting on the bench. They walk my child across the parking lot with no shoes on to his dad. And I'm sitting there, and all I kept thinking was the cycle's repeating itself. I give God thanks that they didn't show up with guns held up at me and whatever, but my son spent the entire weekend wondering if mommy was in jail and if mommy's okay. So that's when and at one point, when the argument was happening, his then fiance was like, don't go to stage 2. And when I realized she said that, I was like, this was planned. I need to address why I'm responding the way that I'm responding. I need to stop giving into these traps that get set. So I sat with myself. I did trauma therapy. And I started to identify and uproot what my trauma and triggers were, because I decided that you're no longer getting a trauma response. And so the book came from me constantly being triggered. And I realized that it became a trend on social media, at least, for people to be like, I'm triggered. This is triggering. I can't handle this. This is a trigger. And I realized that we're not supposed to just identify the trigger. We're supposed to disarm it. We're supposed to say, you know what? Yes, this triggered me, but why is it triggering me? And how can I avoid this environment? And sometimes a trigger is your internal indicator saying this is not safe. But when you get traumatized, the trauma creates a scarring on your brain. If you ask me, like, it puts you in this, I call it a room. It isolates that trauma age into a room where you go back to that room in your mind sometimes and replays the same scenario over and over again. And until you address and identify that the room is there, it starts to create other areas of your life and domino effect in other areas of your life. So for me, my coping mechanism when I was triggered by trauma was to go to the bottle, to start smoking. I went my whole pregnancy not smoking a cigarette. And the second my child's father traumatized me or triggered me, I went to the convenience store and I got a pack of cigarettes. So I had to figure out what I was using to cope. Why was I coping this way? And identify healthy coping mechanisms going forward. What is my love language? What is my, is it sense? What sensories do I need? What do I need to stimulate? And when I was using sex for comfort, what could I use in place of that? Because it wasn't real. There was nothing genuine about the connections I was making when I was running to sex. So what is it and why is it? So when I was sat down with the book, I had to sit down with myself and I had to reverse engineer how I got to where I am today.
Wow. You are awesome. You are awesome. Just the fact that you've stepped out and found out trauma therapy. So your son is in good. It's like you're in good hands. You're readying yourself just in case. And you've learned so much about yourself because trauma, like you say, will show up somewhere when you least expect it. And it seems like you are so prepared. So when is the book coming out? Or it's out already, or?
No, so the launch date is July 5th. So we'll be out next Friday.
So July 5th, everybody, 2024. And is this self-published or?
Yes, so it will be available on Amazon.
On Amazon, available on Amazon. So what do you, because I always like to leave our viewers with something, I don't know, what would you like to say to someone who, because you've given inspiration, you're inspiring, because you've come through that, and that's what we talk about, the arc and how you can come through and what forgiveness looks like and trauma, because that's very important. So what would you like to, as your final sort of,
what would I say? Because I do talk about forgiveness in the book, and it's not just about forgiving them, but forgiving yourself.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
I think that when we start to identify that we were settling for less, we go through stages of like grief, shame, guilt, embarrassment. It's all normal. It's okay.
Yes.
Process it and show yourself grace for surviving the things that you didn't realize that you had to survive in that moment, and you did the best you could with the resources that you had.
You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And when you know better, you do better, we hope. That's the way. And give yourself grace. We're not trying to fix anything here. Give yourself grace.
Right.
Show
yourself grace. And I guess the biggest thing that I would say is if you have to accept an apology you've never received, it's okay to walk away from the people, places, and things that forced you to accept that apology without an actual acknowledgement for what you're feeling.
Yeah.
It's okay to walk away from unhealthy environments, even though the guilt will try to pull you back in. Put up the pillars of boundaries and stay away from anything that would cause you to repeat the cycles of trauma and forgiveness.
Now, I'm not sure. Are you coaching? Is that something you're planning on going into? Because I'm hearing this and I'm going, you're like a coach. I mean, I understand when you say in your bio, mentor. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I don't know where this leads.
It's called I haven't fully marketed it yet, but it's the Trauma Center Mentorship, where you can have one-on-one or group sessions with people. And I would like to start having conversations about disarming the wounds of motherhood, because motherhood is not just for people who are moms. We're all here, so we came from one.
Yeah.
And
yes.
regardless of what that looks like, if it was an adopted mom, a foster mom, there's a wound there that is connected to it.
Yes.
Even if you're trying to have kids and you don't have any and you constantly get exposed to when's the baby coming, that's a wound that needs to be disarmed in a way. So I think just reclaiming the name mom and giving it a different outlook and disarming those wounds that are attached to it. So there's disarming the wounds of motherhood that's coming up, and the trauma center mentorship. And in the book, you'll see it. We go through the impact, the injury, and the treatment. So it's basically, I'm going through the spiritual ICU with you, taking you off of the life support that you've been connected to keep you going, and giving you healthy coping mechanisms to move forward.
I don't know what to say here. You're awesome. And if anybody out there wants to reach out to you, I'm sure we can put that at the end, or whenever you're ready, it'll be up. Your book is out again, July
5th.
July 5th, 2024, y'all.
Thank you.
So that means anyhow, it'll be out 2024. I'm so happy. I'm elated. I'm proud of you. I know I'm not your mom, but I'm proud of you.
Thank you very much.
I'm really, really proud of you. I want to thank you for sharing your journey, your story, because as I say to people, your journey matters, your story matters, your voice matters.
Yes, thank you.
So, Elysha, I thank you again, and I wish you well in whatever you do, whatever your endeavors are, wherever the path leads. And I have no doubt your North Star is shining brightly, waiting for you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to even where this platform is going.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. All right. I want to thank Elysha today, our beautiful CEO, for showing up and lending her voice to this community, for giving us all some inspiration. And for those of you out there, you needed to hear something today. I hope you heard it. And I send you blessings, and I thank you for watching. And remember, always remember, your voice matters. So if you enjoyed this episode, I would really love to hear from you. Email me at info@outraisedvoices.com or SharonLeeWilliams@outraisedvoices.com. Who knows? On a future episode, you could be the CEO. Remember, your voice matters.